Thank you very much, Professor Ismail. Thank you very much for attending this event, ladies and gentlemen. Okay. Okay. So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So, welcome to this event called Studium Generale of Universitas Lia, and it's a real pleasure to have you with us here today. And thank you for joining from any places around Indonesia, I think. So first of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Komar Svendar, and I'll be the moderator for this event this evening. So today's session brings together an exciting and a very relevant topic, especially in our increasingly digital world. And the title of today's um, event is the cybersecurity in the contemporary world, perspective through language, technology, and global business. And we will explore how cybersecurity intersects not just with technology, but also with language and business world. To officially open today's event, so we are honored to invite Ibu Dr. Siti Yulidar Harunasari, MPD, as the Director of Universitas Lia. Okay, and the floor is yours, Bu Siti Yulidar Harunasari.
Thank you, Pak Komara. Good evening, everyone. Before we begin, I would like to extend a warm greeting to University of Lia's Vice Rectors who are with us today, Dr. Ismarita Ramayanti and Dr. Anggoro Budi Susilo, and also to Professor Ismail Suwardi Weke. Thank you all for your presence and your ongoing support for academic activities at the University of Lia. And I would especially like to recognize Professor Ismail Suwardiweke for making today's Studium Generale possible. He has played a key role in building partnerships and organizing events like this, both within our university and with institutions across Indonesia and internationally. So, for all of this, we are truly grateful. Following this, I am delighted to welcome our distinguished guest speaker, Professor Christian Conard from the University of South Wales in the United Kingdom. Professor Conard, thank you so much for joining us today. This is the third time you have shared your knowledge with our university community through online sessions, and we truly appreciate your continued willingness to connect with us and share your insights. Ladies and gentlemen, Bapak and Ibu, adik-adik mahasiswa, I would also like to welcome all lecturers, students, guests from our partner universities, and members of the public who are joining us online. Your participation today shows your commitment to learning and your interest in important issues that affect us all, both now and in the future. So just like Pak Komaras mentioned, today's topic, cybersecurity, perspectives from language, technology, and global business. The topic is both timely and highly relevant. In our daily lives, technology is everywhere. We use the internet for studying, communicating, shopping, and even banking. While technology brings many benefits, it also introduces new risks such as hacking, data theft, and online scams. These are not just technical problems. They involve how we use language online, how businesses protect the information, and how people from different countries work together to keep everyone safe. This is why today's topic is so important and why we are honored to have Professor Conard here with us. As an expert in terrorism and policing research, Professor Conard understands how cybersecurity is connected to many different fields. His insights will help us see the big picture how language, technology, and business all play a role in keeping our digital world secure. And at the University of Lea, we are proud to offer study programs in language, technology, and business. These areas are not separate, they are connected, especially when we talk about topics like cybersecurity. For example, the way we use language in emails or messages, they can protect us or put us at risk. Technology gives us tools, but we need to know how to use them wisely. Businesses must protect their data and ensure their customers are safe. By learning about cybersecurity from different perspectives, we can be better prepared to face the challenges of the future. Everyone, I also want to thank our partner universities for joining us today. Your participation makes this event richer and more meaningful. And to all members of the public attending, thank you for your interest. It is important for everyone in society, not just students and experts, to understand cybersecurity because it affects us all. I encourage everyone to take an active part in today's lecture. Please listen carefully, ask questions, and share your thoughts. This is a great opportunity to learn from Professor Connard and from each other. Let's use this time to expand our knowledge and think about how we can apply what we learn in our daily lives and future careers. Finally, I would also like to thank the organizing committee and everyone who worked hard to make this event possible. Your efforts are truly appreciated. With that, I am pleased to officially open today's Studium Generale. Let's make the most of this opportunity to learn and grow together. Now, I would like to return the session to our moderator, Bapak Komara, to invite Professor Christian Connard to begin his lecture. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the session. Assalamualaikum.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much, Ibu Siti Yuli Darhan Arunasari, for the inspiring and warm remark. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so before we start, I think it is my great honor to introduce our distinguished speaker today, Professor Christian Connard. Let me introduce Professor Connard. So Professor Connard is a leading scholar in international security and counterterrorism and currently serving as Professor of International Security at Batam City University and Professor of Policing and Security at the University of South Wales, where he also directs the International Center for Policing and Security. Professor Connard is the Jane Monnet Chair and Director of both the Jane Monnet Center of Excellence and the Jane Monnet Network on EU Counterterrorism. And his impressive academic journey includes past leadership roles at institutions such as the University of Dundee and international teaching engagements across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. He has been a valued expert for major global organizations, including the European Parliament, NATO, the EU Institute for Security Studies, and the United Nations Development Programme. And over his career, he has been awarded multiple Marie Curie Fellowships, Jane Monnet Chairs, and a Horizon 2020 research grant for work on terrorist radicalization. He's currently the editor of the Journal of Contemporary European Studies and serves on several editorial boards for prominent journals in the field of European politics and integrations. Okay, now we will welcome Professor Christian Connard. But first of all, I think I need to remind the participants, we are going to listen to Professor Christian Connard for around 30 minutes. And after that, we are going to open Q&A session. And those who are interested in asking questions, you can drop your question in the Zoom chat. Okay. So without further ado, so welcome, Professor Christian Conard, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to be there with you. Thank you, dear rector. Thank you, dear moderator. Thank you, Dr. Ismail. It's a fantastic honor to be there with you. I'm so happy to be back, and I'm very impressed with the fantastic turnout that we have at this event. I can already see so many people here that have turned up. So I'm particularly honored that so many people have turned up. I'm really very, very happy to be there with you. So just to give you a little outline of the topic. So I'll be talking a little bit about the question of terrorism and counterterrorism, questions of peace, and particularly also human rights. And I hope that after I speak for 10-15 minutes, then we can also discuss the whole topic in more depth. And I'll be looking forward to all of your questions. So thank you. Thank you so much already in advance. Now, the topic, of course, in terms of terrorism, is a topic that is not a new topic. It's been around for a number of years and it's been widely used. A lot of people are talking about that topic in general. It's perhaps a topic that is not always very, very well understood because to a certain extent it's become part almost of a media hype, right? You see it on CNN, you see it on Fox News perhaps, or wherever it is that you're watching television. It's become even more so part of a particular media hype after, of course, the events of 9/11, which was one major terror attack that was covered live on TV. Perhaps the only time that a very, very large scale terror attack was ever covered live on TV, and millions of people could watch it as they were watching TV. So it has been really something that a lot of people have thought about, have experienced to a certain extent. We had, of course, the events of 9/11 in the United States, but we had many, many more attacks after that. We had, just in Europe, we had several attacks, whether that was Madrid, London, Paris, Brussels, Berlin, Istanbul, and whatever you might remember. We had, of course, also in Asia, many different terror attacks. So it's been really something of a very, very significant security threat. Some people were even making the argument to a certain extent that it was the greatest security threat of our time. Of course, priorities have changed now that we have the return of large-scale wars, but it still is a very significant security threat of our time. And because it is such a significant security threat in our time, we see that the policy response has been significant. Different governments across the different world have responded to a certain extent. And this also means that we have quite a lot to really understand and to grapple with. Now, if we want to discuss what terrorism is, just in conceptual terms, of course, there's a lot of different definitions. Whether we take the definition of the FBI, whether we take the definition of the CIA, whether we take the definition of the Department for Justice. We have at the international level, in fact, only one definition that any international organization has ever defined in legal terms, and that is the European Union. The European Union has defined terrorism as a series of activities that are defined by what they're doing. Perhaps not the most elegant legal definition, but it is a legal definition that therefore can serve a particular purpose in the criminal justice system. We have, of course, a lot of sanctions at the UN level, and I will be talking about the sanctions in more detail, but it just suffices to say that even the United Nations, that has defined many things and that has, in fact, a sanctions regime in place, does not have a legal definition of terrorism also in place. So it is something that a lot of people grapple with. It's not something that is straightforward, and because of that, there have been different perspectives on it. Now, if we just look at the academic world, we can see that people have classified terrorism in different types. So firstly, one of the different types is the distinction between what is a non-state terror activity that we more generally know that's the sort of activity that we imagine when we're talking about, let's say, 9/11, or when we're talking about, let's say, the IRA. That's the type of activity that we imagine for the major part. And that is the state-aided and non-state-based terrorism. But some people have said, well, actually, in the history of mankind, there is not only non-state-based terrorism, but there's also state-based terrorism. That, in fact, some states, if we look at the Second World War, for instance, some states were also perpetrating a terror attack. We see that also in the discussion at the moment with Russia's war in Ukraine, that some people have accused Russia of, in fact, committing terror attacks in their attacks. So there's been a debate about whether states can in fact be terrorists as well in certain circumstances. So we certainly see that distinction between state and non-state-based terrorism. Then we see another distinction, that is whether it is a nation state-based terrorist activity within the nation state, or whether that is in fact an international terrorist activity. So whether it crosses international borders, whether different states are involved rather than just one state, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 states perhaps are involved, especially when it comes to large-scale terror groups. On the whole, we can see that a number of different states were involved. So that's a second distinction. And then there is a distinction based on political motivations. And that's the common way of classifying different terrorist activity, that is based on their political motivation. How can we classify the different terror groups that exist in the world as we can see it? So the first political motivation is a motivation to create an ethno-nationalist state. So independentist movements or ethno-nationalist movements in history have sometimes been classified as terrorist groups. A clear example, for instance, is ETA in Spain, that is campaigning for a Basque national state. They do not want to become or want to remain part of the Kingdom of Spain. They want to have their own state, and in fact have committed terror attacks in order to support that particular political objectives. We can see that also with the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, that has been initially campaigning for an Irish Free State, an Irish Republic. Then after the partition of Ireland to the Irish Republic in the north, continues to exist, in particular in Northern Ireland. So the idea here is that their political motivation is about creating a nation state. That is kind of the first classification. Then the second one is one of ideology. Particularly often here, it can be communist ideology, it can be far left ideology, but in principle, it could be any type of ideology. It doesn't have to be communist or far left. But I just give you a couple of examples for terrorist groups here. We see in Italy, for instance, the so-called Red Brigades from the 1970s, the kind of far left communist supporting terror groups that were called the Red Brigades or Brigate Rosse in Italian. We see the same thing in West Germany at the time in the 1970s, the Red Army faction, or the Baader-Meinhof gang, as it is frequently called in the academic literature, because the founders of that group were Baader and Meinhof. We also have the so-called FARC in Colombia. I mean, they're just one of the various terror groups that are of ideological nature, but they are the kind of left-wing guerrilla movement that have been fighting certain for certain political objectives, in particular the overthrow of the political system within Colombia. And another example is the Shining Path in Peru, similarly of a more left-wing nature. So that's the second category. Then we have the third category, what we might call the religio-political groups. The political objectives here on a particular reading of the religious groups. One of the examples here that could be given is, for instance, Hamas, that has a particular vision of what type of religious governance system they want to have. Here, the idea is the Islamic Republic of Palestine that would fit into this particular category of terrorist groups. And then finally, we have a variety of different single issue groups. So, for instance, animal liberation groups. So, they, as far as we're aware, have never actually killed human beings, but they have on occasion created damage for to property, to people, but not in the sense that they've actually executed a human being or even damaged a human being as such. They basically campaign on a single issue. So a single issue that, like animal welfare, or more recently, maybe environmental groups that are campaigning for a particular vision of environmental protection, that have been, in a sense, sometimes using terrorist methods in order to further their particular political objective. So that's the kind of general categorization. Now, if we then look into terrorism, what we find, counterterrorism, sorry, counterterrorism very often, of course, is nation state based. Very often it starts with the governance structures at the national level, whether that's a policing structure, whether it's a criminal justice structure, and so on. But in particular, when we deal with terrorist groups that cross borders. So I mentioned, for instance, ETA, and I'm going to give you an example that is linked to ETA. What we then find is very often that international cooperation is necessary to actually fight terrorist activity, that without international collaboration between different countries, we are unable to fight that particular group because they have another country as a kind of withdrawal area where they can just hide from the authorities, and therefore they're unable to be captured because they're using that as a kind of a hiding ground as such. And the example here is that of ETA. Spain and France had historically not been on the same side in terms of the fight against ETA, because ETA was initially a group in Spain that was especially linked to fighting against the fascist dictatorship that was the General Franco in Spain, that had won the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s and then had remained in power for a very, very long time. In fact, until the 1970s, he remained in power. And throughout that time period, the Basque nationalists were fighting what was essentially a fascist regime. The French, as a result of that, did not support the Spanish government in their fight against ETA, despite the fact that they were not supportive of the political objective of a Basque independent country. They were not supportive of the Spanish government either, because they saw them as a fascist dictatorship. In 1979, and this is now after the fall of the fascist regime. In fact, General Franco fell in the mid-70s, 1975, and then was subsequently replaced by a transition and ultimately a democratic government. A democratic government that had free and fair elections, that had a constitution, and so on. And as a result, France and Spain came closer together. They abolished, for instance, in 1979, France abolished the possibility for refugee status for Spanish citizens. Until then, it was possible, because they were fighting the General Franco and the fascist regime. It was possible to gain refugee status in France on political grounds. But thanks to the transition towards democracies, this was no longer possible. The culmination of that increasing collaboration was in 1993, the arrest of ETA's Barcelona cell. They were, in a sense, the embryo for European political cooperation in that area on counterterrorism. The so-called Trevi Group, the intergovernmental forum of ministers, interior ministers, that would agree to meet regularly to discuss internal security as part of this Trevi Group. They started in the 1980s, at the same time as the European Union was also embarking on Schengen cooperation. Schengen cooperation was a treaty that was made by other European countries in order to remove internal border controls between different European countries. And as a result of that, of course, you had criminals and terrorists that could also then move across different borders, and that led to more European countries collaborating much more deeply on counterterrorism, also because they needed to protect themselves from that criminal activity. And that was initially as part of that Trevi group, and that also then led to cooperation in other intergovernmental fora, such as the Council of Europe cooperation, that is primarily linked to human rights and human rights convention. Now, the Council of Europe, in fact, was an organization that was very old. It was an organization that was founded after the Second World War, in response, in particular, to the Second World War, and led to a certain Europeanization of the terrorist experience in Europe. The different European countries like United Kingdom, Spain, Italy, Germany, France, that were coming together in this forum and were kind of sharing their expertise on counterterrorism. The European community that also existed at the time had no legal competence in these matters in the 1970s and 80s. But they came together in this particular forum of the Council of Europe, even though nothing to do with the European Union. It was an additional forum where European countries were coming together and they were kind of collaborating in this forum. It was established in 1949 in Strasbourg. It was an organization for voluntary cooperation, no supranational characteristics whatsoever. But because of that, with relatively weak legal instruments, just recommendations, resolutions, opinion, nothing of a binding nature, and more of a political framework in which member states would really just address political issues. But what's important about it, it adopted a number of legal texts that the European Union later came to define as part of its own legal acquis, and therefore started forcing new member states to adopt those legal texts as well. So any new country that wanted to join the European Union had to first adopt those legal texts. Examples here are, for instance, the Convention of Extradition, 1957, 1975, and 1978. We have the Mutual Legal Assistance Agreement in Criminal Matters of 1959 and 1978. We have the Convention of International Validity of Criminal Judgments in 1970 and the European Convention on Suppression of Terrorism of 1977. This all becomes part of the departure for EU action in the field of internal security, with a realization that increasingly terrorism becomes transnational, because terrorism itself, as a security threat, is transnational and crosses international borders. European countries also have to deal with it as a transnational threat and need to collaborate much more closely. I already talked about the bilateral efforts between Spain and France. They became part of what then became a multilateral effort on terrorism, here in particular with the European Union Treaty of Maastricht of 1992, that provided for the first time the legal basis for the European Union to get involved in this area, in general in terms of border controls, criminal matters, but particularly also on counterterrorism policing and so on. Relatively weak legal instruments still, main international convention, but a starting point for the European Union to be involved. Increasingly then pushed after the Amsterdam Treaty of 1997, where the European Union basically creates proper, stronger legal instruments to fight against terrorism and to create what they call the so-called EU's area of freedom, security, and justice. The main achievement in that particular era is after 9/11, the so-called European arrest warrant. The European arrest warrant, really a revolutionary legal instrument that abolishes the whole idea of extradition. Extradition, like I was telling you, between Spain and France, always a major problem because countries didn't want to extradite very often terrorist suspects because they saw that maybe as political interference, maybe they didn't have faith in the other country's judicial system, they didn't trust each other, and so on. So there were always reasons why it wasn't possible to extradite people. But this abolished the entire idea of extradition inside the EU, and they replaced it with a system of surrender. Surrender that is really very close to the system between states in the United States of America. So actually just a handover of a terrorist suspect, much more than an extradition process that works like generally it works on the international level. Um, It used to be somewhat of a diplomatic procedure between different states, where basically you would have to go through the um, foreign and diplomacy establishment of each country, and that now is being abolished or was abolished and became somewhat of an administrative procedure. So no longer could, let's say, the foreign secretary or the foreign minister stop the extradition of individuals on whatever political grounds. There were, in fact, no more diplomatic or political refusals possible for extradition. For instance, like I mentioned, the case between France, Belgium, and Spain. They abolished, in particular, the requirement of dual criminality. Dual criminality meaning that terrorism had to be defined as a crime in both the country where the crime was committed and in the country where the person fled to. That was often leading to that being impossible to hand over the person because either it was in one jurisdiction but not the other, or it was in the other but not in the original one. And that very often then stopped extraditions. Now, the European arrest warrant completely abolished that. There was no longer this requirement of dual criminality. They also used the principle of mutual recognition of criminal judgments, similar to what the Union also uses in a single market, basically obliging the member states to mutually recognize each other's verdicts in court. We then also see that this regime, the European Union's regime, spreads also through the system of the United Nations, in particular, that really is being pushed after 9/11. Here, 9/11 is a critical juncture. So after that, for instance, we have on the 21st of September 2001, the action plan in terms of counterterrorism financing that had two decisive aspects at the time to deal with both the Taliban and bin Laden was the freezing of assets for the Taliban and bin Laden and the freezing of assets for individuals. The EU then implemented that in its own legislation in two-tiered measures based on both common positions that are foreign policy positions as part of the European Union and regulations that were part of the single market and were then freezing those assets inside the European Union, not just in one country, but in all EU countries. The UN here had a very important role to play, in particular the UN Security Council Resolution 1333, where it obliged all member states that they should freeze the assets of bin Laden and associates. And it also drew up the 1267 committees that drew up and updated lists of various individuals that were associated with bin Laden. That led to a proliferation of names and people really criticizing that process, saying that, it's not a proper judicial process. Nonetheless, the European Union then transcribed all of that into European Community law. So all of whatever the UN drew up was then transcribed into EU legislation also. UN Security Council Resolution 1373 also then included the prevention and suppression of financing measures previously that were in international conventions. More recently, we had a number of other developments here in terms of the European Union. We had the development of a so-called security union in the European Union. Security union here, something that starts with a debate in 2016, and the then High Representative for Foreign Security Policy, Federica Mogherini, that suggests we must become more joined up across internal and external policies. We must become more joined up in our security and development policies. In 2017, there's a chapter in the global strategy of the European Union. In its year one report, it emphasized the crucial role that this joined up union, the security union, should be based on this idea of the European Union's joint work across various policy sectors, institutions, and different member states. It calls for a common approach to security and defense between EU member states in order to improve interoperability between the databases of the European Union, to involve industries to resolve a number of issues here, automatically detecting and removing terrorist content online, dealing with encrypted data by communications technologies amongst terrorists, and of course, securing data on evidences. They also talk a lot about the smart distribution of financial resources. Here, the EU negotiates with the formation of a European Defence Fund for the European Industrial Development Programme for boosting the defence industry, and the Athena mechanism that would include battle groups for providing a rapid response to crisis management. They also agreed to share the knowledge on terrorist fighters and homegrown radicalized individuals, and to provide support to victims of terror attacks, and of course to strengthen cooperation across different intergovernmental organizations, here in particular EU cooperation with NATO and also EU cooperation with the United Nations. Now, we also then had an implementation report by the European Commission that suggested that they had managed to develop a number of those initiatives. European Council and the Parliament agreed on what you now see at all the borders of the European Union, an EU entry and exit system. The Commission proposed that all centralized information system for security, borders and migration management would become interoperable, meaning that they kind of work with one another and that they can be accessed by the various actors within the system. Also, we had a development of new Europol regulations that entered into force, with Europol taking a much bigger share in terms of fighting terrorism. We had a directive on combating terrorism, revised firearms directive, and continued work on preventing of radicalism, and of more recently a new and increased role, firstly of the Radicalization Awareness Network, and more recently the EU Knowledge Hub on radicalization. So those were the kind of initiatives that we've seen as of more recently. We've seen that human rights were often an important aspect in terms of thinking about this, but I want to throw the floor open now for a discussion, and I hope that we can have a number of different and good questions, and I look forward to discussing with you in much more detail. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Christian Conrad, for the insightful and thought-provoking lecture. So I'm sure we all gained a great deal from your presentation and the perspectives you shared. And before we proceed, I'd like to take a brief moment to acknowledge several individuals from institutions that I unintentionally overlooked earlier. So we are very grateful for the presence and support from Bapak Akbar Hadi Prasetyo and Ibu Titi Aisyaholic from Sekolah Bahasa Mendiklat Polri, ya Bu, ya Pak, who has been instrumental in their contribution, and your participation truly enriches this event. Ya, Bapak Ibu. Okay. So now we will welcome several questions from the participants. Okay, so you can just type your question in the Zoom chat, and we will select the questions from the Zoom chat. Okay, everyone, we are still waiting for your questions in the Zoom chat.
Yeah, I got one from the YouTube. Yeah,
Oh,
that's
YouTube.
yeah. I sent to the chat box. Yeah.
Okay. So, so we've got questions, Professor Conard, from the YouTube platform. So recent years have witnessed a concerning increase in terrorist activities across the globe, and the 2024 EU terrorism situation and trend report indicated a sharp rise in attacks within the European Union in 2023, with 120 recorded incidents compared to just 28 in the previous year. So while the majority of these were attributed to separatist groups, jihadist attacks, though fewer in number, resulted in the highest casualties. So this highlights the evolving nature of the threat and the continued danger posed by extremist ideologies.
Yes, yes. Thank you for the question. I think I would agree there. So it's definitely very clearly something that we've experienced for quite a while. And as it's been pointed out there, it's also gone up recently. It's gone up in a number of member states. If I'm just giving you one example here, for instance, in Germany, we've seen a lot of small-scale terror attacks recently, but we've also seen a couple of bigger ones. Um, we also have seen that in other member states of the European Union. We've seen a number of foiled attacks. So overall, I think the picture is that despite the fact that increasingly our politics looks at other security threats as well, in particular the threat of war, and especially in the light of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we see at the same time that we have a number of terror attacks. We see an increase across the board. There's certainly an increase here when it comes to jihadi terrorist attacks. We've seen that. Um, but we also see that in other areas of terrorist activities. We see that also in terms of ideological terrorism, ethno-nationalist terrorism. So we see that relatively across the board. So it is something that is concerning. It is something that needs to continue to be monitored, especially in the light of developments also in terms of cyber security and so on. So this is something to continue to monitor. And of course, it brings out this evolving nature of the threat. That's absolutely clear. Yep.
Yeah, thank you very much, Prof. Christian Conard. I think we also have several questions, so we can see in the Zoom chat. We've got questions from Egi Aditya Pradhan. So the question is, do we need to rely on tools to keep our data safe from cybersecurity attack? And also
Yes.
we've got questions from Arena, but I think we can answer the second question first.
Okay, so that's great. In terms of cybersecurity attack, I think it's a very pertinent question. We absolutely are in an environment where we have an increasing amount of cybersecurity attacks because we have two different types of cybersecurity attacks. We have the non-state criminal actors that are, of course, conducting security attacks that are keen to harness data, that increasingly everybody's putting data online, whether that is health data, whether that is commercial data, whatever data that is. So we have the kind of non-state actors that are involved. While at the same time, we also have increasing number of state actors also involved in cyber attacks, um, sometimes also for data harnessing, sometimes also because there's certain political agendas that can be served with data, but sometimes also because maybe critical infrastructure needs to be attacked to create worries and fear within societies. So that increasingly also happens. So in general, it does mean that countries on the whole need to develop their capabilities. They need to increase their capabilities to be able to deal with those type of attacks. And they need to have perhaps really good sections in the army that need to be able to handle those attacks and to fight back when they do occur. So I think that is something that perhaps is more important than ever. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Let's move on to the third question. So the question is from Barena. So do you think AI and big data are effective tools in identifying online terrorist threats before they happen?
Yes and no. I think the yes part, clearly we need technological advancement, and clearly AI and big data can be helpful in that regard. So it is very clear that with technological advancement, there are certain activities that can be monitored more effectively, that can be monitored more consistently. And as a result of that, AI and big data are useful and effective. However, with technological advancement, and I think this is with all technological advancement, it means that not only the security services are going to increase their effectiveness, but the cyber criminals and terrorists are going to increase their effectiveness also, which then means it also creates new vulnerabilities that we didn't perhaps have before. So what that means is that while we need to increase those tools, while we also need to use and harness them, we also need to be aware of the weaknesses that these tools create, and we need to be aware that we need to plug the holes of those particular vulnerabilities and weaknesses. And because of that, in a sense, we need to be aware that the terrorists might be using AI and big data as well. So that then means we need to kind of develop our strategy in accordance with that. But, that's nothing new. Technology is always acting in that way. So it's just a new form of technology, but the process essentially is similar.
Okay, I think we still have more time to answer um, the third question from Aziza. So the question is, what is cyber terrorism and how is it different from regular terrorism? And can hackers be used to fight against cyber terrorism and how?
Yeah. So cyber terrorism is, in fact, I mean, the definition of what a terrorist activity is essentially still the same. So it needs to have a political motivation in order to create physical damage or harm or potential killing, in order to instill fear in a particular segment of the population, the government, or anything thereof. So that's the definition of terrorism. Cyber is the platform in which that particular activity is then being conducted. So, for instance, you might be able to kill people through an attack on critical infrastructure. So you could have a terror attack through a particular virus or particular malware or whatever that attacks a particular critical infrastructure, therefore attacks a segment of the population and therefore creates a certain fear within that segment of the population. Now, that is essentially making it slightly easier for the terrorists in the sense that they are able to do that from their home or somewhere else where they can access the internet, but from a computer or from a device that is able to conduct those type of attacks, and ultimately then use that as a new type of method in their terrorist activity. Now, it isn't different in the sense of the impact. The impact is still meant to be either damage, fear, or some sort of mixture of the two. The impact is always the same. It's just the convenience in which that can be done. Also, the radicalization process that is increasingly happening online, that means that we can have a technologized radicalization process. So you can have the whole chain of radicalization online in a way that you couldn't do before. So all of those things are, in a sense, making it electronic and making it, in a sense, online and easier, but ultimately with the same objective, with the same purpose. So that then means um, the the impact might be similar, but the way in which it is being conducted is different. So, can hackers be used to fight against cyberterrorism? Yes, of course. If they have an indication as to who the cyber terrorists are, they can trace them on the internet and they can fight back. So, in that sense, also having cyber units is a very useful activity. Can they be stopped? Not necessarily. Sometimes cyber also has hideaways and so on, but it is certainly useful as an additional tool in the fight against cyber terrorism. So that is a possibility as long as you can trust them. So I'm saying in principle it can be done. In practice it needs to be vetted. So that's something that we'll need to just see. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Um, so I think we still have 1 more minute to discuss the questions of Christian Conrad. So let me select one plus question. Okay. So from M. Azhara Madian. So if there is a terrorist attack involving large groups on a nationwide scale, and uh, um, what actions can the United Nations take to stop it?
Yes. So we would all wish that the United Nations was the type of institutions that could easily get involved in something immediately. That's unfortunately not the case. The United Nations is a slightly more slow-moving bureaucracy. So in that sense, it's not something that can easily counter a specific terror attack. What they can do is to provide a good framework in order to regulate certain activities that they can help nations, in a sense, tackle some of those um, structural issues. So that is something that perhaps the United Nations is able to help individual member states. It's more difficult when it comes to a large-scale terror attack. They can sometimes support in terms of supporting maybe for the victims and things like that. But to really to stop it, it would probably be very difficult for the United Nations because the United Nations is not the type of institution that can really go out quickly and fight terrorists. That's not usually the nature of the United Nations. So it is a little bit more difficult to do that.
Thank you very much, Professor Christian Conrad, for the insightful discussion and explanation. Okay, so as we come to the end of today's Studium Generale, so on behalf of the organizing committee, so I'd like to thank you very much, Professor Christian Conrad, for the insightful session, Dr. Siti Uldar Harnasari for the opening, and also the presence of the Vice Rector of Universitas Lia, Bapak Dr. Anggara Budi Susila, and also from Bapak Akbaradi Prasetyo and Ibu Titi Aisyah Holik from Sekolah Bahasa Lembelat Polri, and also to all participants whose names I might not be able to mention individually. So thank you for your presence and participation. So before we close, let's take a group photo together, and you may also turn on your camera if you're comfortable. Okay. So I think I'm going to take picture. So let me count. 1, 2, 3. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay, one more. Okay. So thank you very much for the participation. So for those of you who have not filled the attendance form, so Prof. Ismail has shared the G form for you to fill because you have attended this event. So thank you very much and goodbye everyone. So see you one another next time.
Thank you. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you, Prof. Kauner. Thank you, Bu Rector, and
Thank
Thank you,
you.
everyone.
Prof. Connor,
Thank
Prof.
you.
Ismail, Pak Komara. Thank you,
Yeah.
everyone. 138 participants. Thank you very much.
Thank
We
you.
see you
Welcome.
soon, Professor
Thank you.
Connor in Indonesia, Jakarta.
I look forward to it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
To make easy for the committee to send you certificate, feel free to have the attendance list on the chat box. And then, inshallah, on the next month, on June, Prof. Kauner will be a keynote speaker for our symposium. So let us have your email through the attendance list in order to invite you for another program from Universitas LIA. Universitas LIA has already established some kind of the center of excellence. Among of them are about entrepreneur, about the Japan language, Japanese language, and then English. So feel free if you want to have Merdeka Belajar or Kampus Berdampak. So take a look and then you can contact Pak Komara. Thank you, Prof. Kauner. Thank you, Ibu Rector, and everyone. See you soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye bye.